People often mention 1930s recipes, but few really know what kept people alive during those tough times. If you're curious about the gritty reality behind survival foods, then let's start right away. Salt pork and milk gravy is something that was European, both in tradition and concept. You might wonder how something like that ends up on a list of the most popular things to eat when you have no money, right? Well, that has to do with how communal the country became during the Depression. You've only grown up hearing the phrase, "love thy neighbor." These people? They lived a traumatizing decade following that to the letter. See, many people had to reach out to the communities that were present in America and learn new ways of cooking, new recipes, and new ways to save costs and stretch supplies to last longer. That's how dishes like these started to become popular. The idea of salting your pork was something that people took to immediately because of how much it helped to preserve food, and this was doubly true for places that never ever had any source of preservation or where meat was hard to come by. Lots of people made do with the ingredients they had on hand, but as far as peasant food went, this was one of the more versatile and filling options to go for. So, the thing about lard biscuits was that it was essentially too available. Lard's pretty much just rendered pig fat, if you weren't familiar. Sometimes, people use cooking fat to add flavor and texture to a dish, and it helps to really make it an overall more filling meal. Now, since most of the urbanization hadn't taken place yet in America yet, and there were still loads of rural areas to go around, lard biscuits became very common. They were far more affordable than butter or oil, which is what you would usually use for your cooking if you had some spare change you didn't need to hold on to. It became such a common element of Southern cooking that it also eventually just became a tradition that people associated with the region. It's now a deeply ingrained part of American culture. Historically, biscuits were a big part of the way people lived in the South during hard times of the Depression. Leavening agents were really just the most worrisome part of the entire haul. You get baking powder and baking soda, which helps a lot in making the biscuits rise. You want your cookies fluffy, after all, not chewy and soggy. Now, the people would usually cut lard into the dry stuff, such as the flour and baking powder. Since flour was a rarity, most people used all-purpose flour. The rest was just the typical biscuit process, really. They're a lot better than you'd think, but they did cause lots of health issues over time, too. Molasses, lard, bacon grease, these were the tools of the trade back then. Using them, people made all sorts of things like molasses porridge. Why was this something you wanted, especially over regular porridge? Well, it's simple. In the context of the economic crash out of the 1930s, milk was simply too much for people to afford regularly, and at the exact same time, porridge was something that people needed to eat every day. Molasses porridge was a very cheap dish that could make a big meal out of a small amount of ingredients. It was exactly the kind of thing you would need for a family back in those times, especially when so many families began to live together for fear of running out of resources too quickly. This was especially true for people who had elderly families. Molasses porridge was something that was seen in New England in their rural communities more than anywhere else. The reason porridge helped so much was because you could also add all kinds of scraps, leftovers, and dried fruit to it so that you could make it better. People would also add in stuff like lime, cinnamon, or nutmeg if they wanted to, and that would often make it better. Fried bologna hash was a classic dish that got a lot of traction out of the middle of the 20th century. The dish was basically something that was insanely available in terms of ingredients. Bologna was a really easy-to-get processed meat, and it was often sold in these decently sized packages. It's always such a blessing when the company decides to, not skim off the top and actually give you a pretty generous package. Plus, bologna was quick, really quick. You opened the package it came in, then you just put in the rest of the stuff. Now, back then, people were mostly just relying on crops and vegetables they had grown on their own through their backyard gardens and rationing efforts. One of these was potatoes, which was honestly such a lifesaver. Onions were also something people added occasionally. As for the bologna itself, people would usually fry that until it was decently caramelized, and then they'd mix it in with potatoes for a starchy and savory aftertaste. The hash was something that people served on its own, or sometimes with, like, a fried egg. It really helped to add basic things like that because you were always getting less protein than you ideally should have. Crackling cornbread is a pretty traditional Southern dish that comes right out of the family cookbooks of this decade, so that should tell you something about how much grandmas loved it. Crackling cornbread sounds a lot more climactic than it really is though, so let's go through what makes it so crackling. Basically, they're made with chicharrones, or otherwise known as pork cracklings. These are crispy fried bits of fat that were rendered when the pork was being cooked, and they most typically come from the fat back or the skin of a pig. Now, one bit of time-specific context that's really important here is that people were using every part of the pig they could back then. Crackling cornbread was another variation of that kind of mentality where people really wanted to not let anything go to waste, especially the pig. Why was the pig so special though? Well, unlike chickens, ducks, and even beef, the pig was the only animal that had use outside of the plate too. You could use its bones for broths, you could use its fat for cooking, you could get lard out of it. That's what made this animal so important. And that's why so many dishes like crackling cornbread came out of the South when pigs were commonly being consumed due to the shortage of other options. Now, you've heard of lots of kinds of different sandwiches, but a bean sandwich might be new even for us. What does it typically consist of? Well, you basically treat the beans as a spread here. The cooked beans often get mashed and then they're mixed with seasonings and herbs to add a bit of an aromatic kick to them. Typically, people were using regional beans that were really easy to get. You know as well as I do that convenience runs in the blood of every American, my friend. Pinto beans, navy beans, and kidney beans were some of the most accessible kinds of beans around and were the easiest to get. Lots of hardship economically meant that people had no option but to rely on things like these for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but particularly breakfast. With lunch and dinner, you could still run a soup or some kind of stew and get away with it. But what did people do for breakfast? Butter and toast? Couldn't have worked. You were saving that bread for more filling options, and butter was expensive. Things like bean sandwiches were really helpful because they were a reliable go-to breakfast option that also had a lot of health benefits like protein and fiber. Peanut butter gravy on rice is a fantastic example of how inventive people were during the Depression. See, the thing about this is that peanut butter was one of the best things you could buy during the Depression for several reasons. If the constant use of lard didn't tip you off, people were really treasuring fat wherever they could find it. Secondly, people needed as much protein as they could afford to get or forage. Peanut butter was luckily proficiently loaded in both of these things, but on top of that, it was also pretty cheap. It was one of the best sources of protein and fat within that price range. You might wonder how they got a gravy going out of this, though. Well, you'd add some water or milk, usually water, and something to thicken the gravy with, like all-purpose flour. If people could spare it, just a bit of margarine for some more richness and basic seasonings were also really helpful. You'd get somewhat of a gravy going with this, and on rice it was filling enough. Another really popular thing to get around the time for breakfast was rye bread with lard spread. Now, lard spread was a pretty good way of using any kind of lard you had. Rye bread was also a pretty economical choice to go for because the average white bread was a little too expensive. Brown bread or rye bread were the kinds of options people were going for when they did their grocery shopping trips. Also, people who lived further away from places that were selling basic essentials and groceries also focused on rye bread for the fact that it would last longer. Little things like this really added up and made a difference in how people approached their shopping. One of the best uses of lard outside of just using the fat for cooking was to make a spread out of it. You might be thinking if that could really be so good, and I get where that thought comes from. Under normal or let's say even typically bad circumstances? Probably not. It's nothing special, but in the 1930s, literally anything that added even a crumb of flavor to what you were eating was a godsend. So the thing about Depression-era cooking was that it led people to places they never thought they'd go to. Previously, we actually discussed in detail how people started using all of the pig. What you probably didn't think was that this meant literally everything. Yes, even the feet. Pickled pig's feet were one of the best things to go for if we're talking about people who drew the short end of the stick during the Depression. Not all economic stress was equal. People that were living in urban hubs, especially the big-name states and cities, had it much better than local towns and rural populations that were struggling to keep going. These parts of the pig, often considered offal, were not sold at market rate prices, and usually were a lot cheaper than other cuts of meat. The thing with those cuts was that even if they were available, which they rarely were since they were also being rationed heavily, they'd leave quite a gap in your budget. Pickling the pig's feet with vinegar and taking advantage of its acidity meant that the meat lasted longer too, and that goes to show you how dedicated people were to getting as much use as they could out of everything they had. Have you ever heard about coffee soup? Sounds like a fever dream, right? Yet that's exactly what it is. A soup made with coffee. As offensive to your familiar taste buds as that sounds, hear me out. You take some coffee, scraps of bread, and sometimes mineral or brown sugar and milk, and then you'd brew the coffee. Then you'd mix in those pieces of bread in the hot coffee and add whatever sweeteners and spices you had, and that was pretty much that. They call it a soup, but in practice it's more like coffee with extra steps, really. Still, it was a far better use of your cup of joe than just drinking it plainly. This way, you could get carbs in the form of bread, some much-needed glucose from sugar to help keep your brain running, you got your daily hit of caffeine, and the spices would help keep you active. People didn't look at food the same way we did back then, which is why some of these dishes might seem really outlandish to you. We look at food and think about pleasure, fulfillment, and what suits our tastes. They'd look at food and think about sustenance and practicality. How much can we get out of this? What can we get out of this? That kind of thinking led to people trying things we'd never think of today. Split pea cakes are another example of how often peas and beans were the saving grace of American households during the Depression. The best thing about these things was arguably how easy they were to make. All you had to do was boil them, which meant that lots of people could effectively use this recipe. Some of the Depression-era recipes straight up just don't apply to people who don't have certain kitchen appliances or ovens or a steady supply of electricity. Split peas were something everyone had, from urban areas to outskirts and rural ones. It also helped that split peas worked so well with the kinds of things people already had on hand. A binder, like all-purpose flour or some mashed potatoes, was also really helpful in holding the mix together. Plus, they went great with potatoes overall. The thing is, though, and this is really important in why people chose cakes over easier meals, is because people sorely missed sweets. Thanks to the Depression, basically any item that could be used for baking or even just for a change of taste wasn't something you'd ever find anymore. It was too expensive, too costly, and it meant that people never got the desserts they grew up with. That really dampened people's spirits all year round, and peas were common enough that people could spare some for a cake once a week. Watermelon rind stew isn't something you'd see anywhere today, but it was the talk of the town back in the 1930s. Watermelons, including the rind, are actually pretty wasted. People almost always throw away the rind, and very few actually try to do anything with it. Back in the 1930s, even the rind was used. The green skin on the exterior of the watermelon was something people peeled away, but they'd usually save it to make jelly or something out of it. The rind was also cut into cubes, strips, and whatever else people could find use for. The rind was then cooked and boiled until it was soft enough to be eaten, and it was also salted so that any excessive bitterness could be controlled. Once people did make the rind, they'd add it to the base of a stew that was made from some pretty hands-on ingredients, basically whatever people had lying around. The biggest reason people wanted to use the rind was because it was like really high in water content. It could soak up any kind of seasonings because of that too, which meant that it was easy to give the rind some extra flavor. As unconventional as it was, it meant that a big fruit like a watermelon could be used entirely to maximum benefit. Dumplings? In my historically accurate assessment of the Depression? Impossible, right? Well, actually, if we really get technical about the details, cabbage and water dumplings were some of the best things to eat during the Depression. They were always called water dumplings, but don't get any ideas. These were on a completely different spectrum from your typical dumplings. As usual, if it was something that people ate in the Depression almost regularly, that meant that it was affordable. Cabbage was actually the spitting image of economical, really, and that's because it was free. Not catching my drift? Well, most people started growing things like cabbage in their victory gardens. These were backyard patches of fertile soil that people started planting on to get some food on the side. Water was already something that people already had for free, so when you mix the two together to make a filling for dumplings, you actually get a pretty decent and easy-to-prepare snack. All you need is water, salt, cabbage, and some flour, or a substitute for it. Then, you just prepare the dough and drop it right into the broth. They're actually even softer than your typical steamed dumplings, if you can believe it. The best part about this recipe was probably the way it didn't need yeast or flour at all to make it work. Usually with steamed dumplings, you need either of the two or both to make the dumplings rise, but these ones worked on their own. Even today, some places do still enjoy their fair share of vegetable and water-based dumplings, but it's largely become a forgotten tradition now thanks to all the other options we have when it comes to dumplings. Hominy and cracklings were a big Southern staple, both in and outside of the Great Depression. While they were always very appreciated for the fact that it was such an inexpensive and filling meal, especially whenever money was tight, the history behind them is tied a little bit to the nature of the land itself. See, hominy is made from corn kernels, and a very specific type of kernel too. These ones are typically treated with lye or lime, and this is done so that the hulls of the kernels are removed. What this does is it makes them more digestible. Still, why does that make them such an accessible option? Well, both cracklings and hominy come from two things that are always in abundance in the South, and if you've ever been there, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Pigs and corn are two things you just can't run out of up there, even if you tried. Chicharrones are things that we've already gone over. That fried pork fat is something the South can never let go of. Hominy works so well because, agriculturally speaking, the South is really good for growing corn. It's one of their top products and crops, and that hasn't changed even in the 21st century. You put two and two together, and you get the format for a meal that just won't let you down, especially when times are rough and your funds are stretched thin. Potato peel soup is another classic dish. Now, it's not just watermelons. People actually tried saving the peels and skins off of everything: apples, oranges, and even potatoes. It's because next to corn, things like these were the easiest food to get in the country around that time. Potato peels were especially necessary because they had an incredible amount of fiber in them, which meant that you would go a lot longer between your soup and the next meal. It helps keep your appetite low, and anything that did that during the Depression was something people really needed more and more of. Potato peel soup was a cost-effective and simple way to have some kind of sustenance on the table. All you needed was water and the peels. People would add basic seasonings like spices or salt and pepper, but it wouldn't really do all that much. Despite that, people still stuck to this like it was their bread and butter, because it was simply one of the cheapest meals you could have. Eating without worrying about how it's affecting your budget or your supplies is actual rest and relaxation, and that's something people were living without almost every day. Black-eyed pea fritters were actually something people almost always associated with New Year's. It was something that was synonymous in the South back then with New Year's Eve celebrations, especially during the 1930s. If you go explore any kind of African American or Southern culture, then you'll find that this is a timeless dish. Black-eyed peas in and of themselves aren't something you can separate from the culture at all, but this recipe also reflects how they can be adapted for hard times. Black-eyed pea fritters were a really creative way to use some cheap ingredients. People would also sometimes add in stuff like meat and leftover bacon and sausages if they could spare it. Any kind of greens they were growing or any scraps of spinach they had would also work. Maybe the nicest part of this dish is the way you could repurpose leftovers or stretch meals to make them more heavy, or how you could use them to ration things out so they'd last even more. You could buy them in bulk too, so that meant you could get a bit of a discount at the local grocery shops. Onion sandwiches were a really simple meal that worked perfectly as a Depression-era breakfast. Red onions, green onions, normal ones, anything that people could get their hands on worked. Onions were also really filling thanks to the incredible amount of flavor they come with, and if you bother with caramelizing them and using a few scraps of leftover meat or pig parts, then you actually have yourself an almost solid meal. Raw onions have a pretty pungent taste, but people used to eat sandwiches filled with those too. People found themselves eating all kinds of meals that pretty much just extended their pantry as much as possible. The taste, flavor, and how good it felt, all of that wasn't even the third or fourth priority. Onion sandwiches are also pretty self-explanatory. There's not a lot to go over with this dish, but it is interesting how people adopted practices from other cultures. For example, in Southeast Asian communities in America, it was very common to consume raw onions with curries and bread or carbs. Vinegar pie is something that's been around for a while, but it was also a dish that really saw a sky-high increase in public affection throughout the Depression. Remember how I was just talking about the way people really didn't get any kind of sweets during the Depression? It was rough. I meant that people never ever got things for celebrations. Many birthdays were spent without cakes, many holidays were spent without any decorations or sweets, and whenever people had a sugar craving or just genuinely did need sugar, not even as a craving like their body literally needed it, they could never access it. Vinegar pie, on the other hand, was tangy, but also sweet. It was a unique dessert that teetered on the edge of being a proper sweet while still being affordable and simple enough that just about anyone could make it without worrying. Vinegar pie goes all the way back to the early 19th century, but it resurfaced right around the 1930s as a part of mock food culture. People wanted to mimic the way lemon pie tasted, and I honestly think they got pretty close. Would you ever try giving this unorthodox pie a fair shot? Beet greens with vinegar show a lot of the lifestyle choices that people were making and gravitating towards during the Depression. Simple things, filling meals, dishes that had a lot more health benefits than fancy tastes or European twists. Families were really struggling to afford just about anything meat-related, so they clutched the vegetables that were similar to it, whether that was in texture or taste, as closely as they could to their chests. They'd take beet greens from a bunch of beets and a tablespoon of vinegar. Then, some bacon grease or vegetable oil would work. If you were using fresh greens, then you would usually trim the stems and leaves. But people would even save these because you could use the leaves to sew holes in clothes or the stems for medicinal treatments. The best part about this dish was again that you could pretty much just make it over an open fire. It was a bit tricky to make because the greens were really prone to wilting as they cooked, which is naturally what happens, so people really reached out to their neighbors for once with help in how to perfect the recipe and technique. Lots of people relied on vinegar as an addition in a lot of their dishes because it helped a lot, whether it was in adding some tang and contrast to the dishes. You could also serve this dish with some beans or potatoes, and it would actually pair a lot better than you would think, especially if you were using mashed potatoes. Cowpea stew is another example of how black-eyed peas are a cultural pillar of many communities, especially the American South. It was such a common thing to see in family cookbooks, community cookbooks, and even the government pushed for people to start using more of this. Cowpea stew would typically just look like the black-eyed peas and a little bit of fat just for flavor. People used vegetables such as onions and garlic, carrots or potatoes, and then herbs like parsley and thyme. Dried black-eyed peas were also something that was not only available in bulk, but was also something that was really commonly grown throughout the South. Lots of places that had farming land or had traditions of growing their own food were living marginally better during the Depression because of how they were used to treating food the way people were starting to. Conservatively, with intention and planning, cowpea stew was actually a special dish because it was one of the few things that didn't feel like you were stretching it. Lots of the stuff on here, like potato peel soups and lard with toast, that kind of stuff really was tiring for people to eat all the time. Cowpea stew wasn't just affordable and accessible, it was delicious and healthy, which made it a real star during this entire decade. So the thing with baked onions is that they were really good, and they were definitely a perfect way to warm yourself up in the winter, but they were also very restricted. By that I mean that if you didn't have an oven, you could simply forget about using your onions this way. The best part about this is that it meant you could actually make do with 1 or 2 onions instead of using more than that, so it also let you stretch your pantry out just a bit more. However, again, this was something you would only see in urban hubs and big cities. Go over to Detroit or California, where people had pretty much bought ovens before the Depression had hit, and yeah, sure, you would find neighbors sharing baked onions and cooking something, but if you went to the other side of America, you would get a different picture. This is also a part of why families decided to migrate and live with their relatives in cities. They simply had more to work with. Sugarless applesauce is pretty much an example of Depression-era cooking that gets into the thrifty side of things. I say this because it was really uncommon for people to ever picture making any kind of applesauce without sugar. It started becoming a trend during the Depression because it also helped people preserve their apples, and those were often ones people were growing in their own gardens and orchards at home. People preferred these because, for one, they were free, and two, they also didn't have any sweeteners. Apples already have natural sugar, so why mess with what God made and add some stuff you don't even need, or like that just jacks up the price at any grocery market? Exactly. The thing was, though, that this recipe took a lot of apples, so if you ever had apples that were on the verge of spoiling, then this was a fantastic way to get rid of them. It was practical, it was convenient, and it was actually pretty good and sweet despite what you may think. Parsnip bread is actually a bit more complicated than you would think. It's a root vegetable that people use as a substitute for more expensive stuff like sugar or sweeteners that they otherwise couldn't access. Now again, this was more a requirement for people who had spent their lives living in cities and were used to having additives and preservatives in everything they bought and ate, which is why they weren't used to not having sweeteners. Parsnips are actually naturally pretty sweet, and that fact only becomes a lot more apparent if you roast them or boil them. Luckily, this was one recipe that could be a lot more widespread in the country thanks to the way it didn't require any kind of kitchen appliances like ovens. No baking or anything, just plain old boiling and roasting. The ingredients were a bit of a financial barrier, though, because you did need things like white flour and baking soda. People substituted that with a mixture of a little bit of white flour and whole wheat, and it worked for the most part. The sugar that people did have, they would add really sparingly. The bread would rise very well too, which meant that it was the perfect thing to go for when your bread was stale, running out, and you had nothing left to work with. People would usually enjoy parsnip bread with soups and stews, just like we do. Wheat germ muffins, on the other hand, were something that mostly saw a lot of use during the Depression, never before or after that. It makes sense because if you put it in the context of the Depression, this thing has an edge over most recipes. It's got minerals and vitamins. It's packed with a lot of energy, and it even helps you stay full longer. Outside of the Depression, you could fill up entire Pinterest boards with the amount of foods that do that while also tasting a lot better. Wheat germ muffins were a recipe that could also be adapted into several different variations too, which meant that most people could put their own spin on it according to their regional tastes. For example, in the South, people really prefer dried fruits, so that was the go-to addition there. In the North, people liked fruits and warm spices more, so stuff like cinnamon and nutmeg was heavily used. Recipes from the 1930s around wheat germ muffins are built in a way that utilizes every single ingredient. As far as the muffins themselves go, they're actually delectably soft and very fluffy. Not at all what you would expect out of a bare-bones recipe. If you think about scrapple cakes, then you can pretty much think of them as a kind of meat pudding. It's actually fitting that we end on a foreign dish because it's exactly during the Depression that people first learned to appreciate all the different communities, cultures, and traditions that thrive within America. Specifically in Pennsylvania, where there was a large German and Dutch population, this was a popular item to make. Scrapple is typically made from minced offal and pork meat, and it's mixed with different kinds of spices and cornmeal. People also tend to add buckwheat and pork bow to make a healing and rich broth. People used to go around calling this the poor man's bacon, but I guess life has a funny way of humbling everybody, doesn't it? Those same people found themselves swearing by scrapple cakes. People found a lot of newfound appreciation for all the different kinds of meals that people who came from other places and settled in America had to offer. It was really helpful to learn recipes like these because they were a lot more resourceful and practical than most of the cookbooks that people were working with at the time. Cornmeal mush is usually made with water or milk and is a type of pudding or porridge depending on the needs of the meal. This became incredibly widespread in the southeastern and eastern bits of America, and it makes sense given how much wartime rations were consumed there. When the government would hand those out, they would often make a point to lower sugar usage and use molasses to conserve other ingredients, so people would pair cornmeal mush along with them. Mush is a more accurate term since it does kind of land somewhere in the middle ground between a pudding and a porridge. It has the consistency of the latter, but it gels and sets like the former, which gives it a slightly airy texture too. Did you know it would not be cooked in milk though? That was set after the mush was prepared to cool it down. When you think of popcorn, the Dust Bowl era is probably the last thing that comes to mind. Popcorn is the comfort food of the movie theaters, but believe it or not, they were still all the rage back in the 30s when options were limited. During the Dust Bowl, these crunchy snacks took on a whole new role. Yes, they paired popcorn with milk back then, and it became the combo of our dreams. When milk was available, it was poured over freshly popped popcorn to turn the snack into a whole meal. Milk was scarce, so it wasn't always available, but when it was, this meal was everyone's go-to. Popcorn was a cheap and easily accessible grain, and milk, if you were lucky enough to have some, added a bit of protein and calcium. It might not be your first choice for a fancy dinner, but it was a clever way to make do with what was available. Yes, you heard it here first, Skunk Stew. Even when the Dust Bowl left dinner plates empty, people were not the only ones who could not escape being eaten, not even skunks. Now, before you start gagging, let me explain. Skunks were not the preferred source of protein, but when the resources were scarce, the farmers made do with whatever they could hunt down. Cooking skunk stew was not for the faint-hearted. First, you had to, de-skunk the skunk. It was mandatory to have the scent glands removed unless one wanted the house cleared faster than a tornado. After washing, it was cooked with what vegetables and spices were available. The result? A rather soft and gamey meal that was palatable though, but not one that would make me eagerly look forward to the next meal. Skunks may sound like the butt of some jokes, but these animals were a good source of protein food when all else was scarce. And can you imagine? A skunk was not as smelly as other wild games like raccoon or possum? Talk about a backhanded compliment. While skunk stew appears to be the epitome of the challenge-accepted food that is popular today for the survivors of the Dust Bowl, it was a symbol of survival. They made desperation into dinner. As they say, where there is life, there is a chance to live, and sometimes to live, you have to eat the wild, literally. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. Speaking of food combinations, this next one will definitely blow your mind. Have you ever thought of combining beef with gelatin? If not, this is your sign to twist things up a bit and try this one out. There's a reason why this one was the talk of the town during the dirty 30s. The gelatin was used to thicken soups and stews, while the beef added a hint of protein. Now, since the supply was always limited, don't expect a whole beef steak in your bowl. Just a few chopped up bits and pieces of meat and every few bites was all you got. This meal was designed to be full, and it was left bland for the most part. However, some people in the South decided to spice things up a bit by remixing the recipe according to their likes. One such recipe included canned corned beef, canned peas, gelatin, lemon juice, and vinegar. We wouldn't consider pairing these ingredients today, but it was a lifesaver for those who had to make it through the hard times. If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world, since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that adage. Oatmeal went out the window, and cornmeal came in, especially as the base of dishes like Johnny cakes, which were the cravings of everyone. They were made from fried cornmeal gruel, hot water, salt, or sweetened milk if it was available. People used a specific kind of pan to make these too, and it was known as a spider pan. Essential to the Johnny cake experience was keeping a very watchful eye on them to ensure the crisp did not burn, as well keeping a constant supply of bacon fat. That was another thing that got popular, as people would store the fat from strips of bacon up and use it in dishes like this. In half an hour, you had a pretty decent lunch made with some pretty bare-bones ingredients. Carrot marmalade came to the rescue when gelatin and popcorn weren't doing much for the taste buds. Now, marmalade usually involves citrus fruits, but during the Dust Bowl, folks had to get creative. This was a pairing that ensured nothing went to waste in the kitchen, including carrots that had slightly gone bad. This wasn't just a treat, but it was a way to preserve the sweetness in fresh fruits and vegetables because fresh produce was hard to come by. This marmalade was made by boiling carrots with sugar and a bit of lemon juice, creating a spread that could be used on bread or biscuits. Plus, carrots are packed with nutrition. Carrots are packed with antioxidants like beta-carotene and lutein. These compounds have protective effects against oxidative stress and inflammation. If you believe that eating insects is a modern, sustainable practice, you are wrong. In the Dust Bowl, crispy fried grasshoppers were not a joke. They were a staple food. During the poor harvests, and when meat was hard to come by, farmers looked to the hordes of grasshoppers feeding on the crops. Talk about revenge dining. Hunting grasshoppers was a family event, and when you had gathered enough grasshoppers in a bucket, then the cooking process started. They were washed, marinated, and then fried to a crisp golden brown. The result? A crunchy snack that contained protein and was not too shabby if one didn't consider what they were consuming. Grasshoppers are in fact a form of superfood, as they contain high protein, iron, and good fats. The Dust Bowl families were not consciously trying to innovate, but they were able to feed themselves in a way that many others could not. Also, if you fry anything, it automatically becomes at least 50% tastier, doesn't it? Nowadays, insects are being considered as a source of food, but in the past, crispy grasshoppers were a means of feeding oneself. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much, since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. Now, I don't know if you've ever thought of eating a dandelion fresh from the fields, but our ancestors have done it all for us. Yeah, dandelion salad was a staple during the Dust Bowl era. Since there were no fancy crops to harvest, dandelions had to do the job, and they did it pretty well. People would harvest the dandelion greens and toss them in a salad. Now, I'm not saying it would win any Michelin stars, but hey, it provided some vitamins and roughage, which is more than you can say about canned tumbleweed leaves. To make dandelion salad, The leaves were washed and mixed with whatever other ingredients were available, things like onions, radishes, and even bits of bacon if you were lucky. Believe it or not, this salad was actually tasty, or at least that's what I've heard. I guess we'll have to try it ourselves to know for sure. You might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. Cornbread was one of the most popular sources of carbohydrates back in the day. Since there wasn't much food available, this one was a reliable provider of instant energy and kept folks fueled through the toughest days. Cornbread was versatile too. It could be served with just about anything, from a hearty bean soup to a simple stew. It was the kind of bread that could stand up to the most basic of meals and still make them feel a bit more complete. Plus, it was easy to make in large batches, which was a huge plus when feeding a family when pockets were tight. This was a staple during the Dust Bowl because cornmeal was cheap and filling. You could whip up a simple cornbread loaf, fry up corn fritters, or even make mush. What's for dinner? Oh, just a small something that came in from the backyard. Yes, the tumbleweed casserole was a real dish during the Dust Bowl, which just goes to show you that when the going gets tough, the tough make casseroles out of tumbleweeds. Tumbleweeds, those rolling shrubs of the Wild West screen, are actually technically, or at least partially, edible. Not fancy for the tongue, but we are hungry to the bone. Let's give it a try, edible. The process began with the boiling of the tumbleweed leaves to reduce their coarse feel and also to reduce the bitterness of the leaves. Then they'd get layered with whatever ingredients were available, maybe some scraps of meat, potatoes, or canned goods if you were lucky. The result? A surprisingly substantial, earthy flavored casserole that was as much about sustenance as it was about taste. Tumbleweed is very fibrous and even has a few vitamins in it, so it wasn't the worst thing to eat when fresh greens were scarce. Moreover, tumbleweeds were free and easy to come by, nature's grocery store if you will. Though you'll never see it on the dinner table. Tumbleweed casserole represents Dust Bowl endurance. Would I eat it? Well, I'd need a serious pep talk and a lot of seasoning. But hey, if the tumbleweed can take the hot winds, then it should not be a problem on my plate. In Texas, as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Who doesn't love the aroma of a good homemade casserole? Well, this hearty meal was still winning hearts even during the Dust Bowl days. Now, during the Dust Bowl, casseroles weren't the fancy, cheesy concoctions we know today. They were more like a hodgepodge of whatever was on hand. Leftover vegetables, some mystery meat, maybe some canned beans, all thrown together in a baking dish. Not exactly Instagram-worthy, but it was a way to use up scraps and fill up the dining table. Plus, they were the stars of potlucks and holiday dinners. This was the era of coming up with all different recipes for casseroles and everything from hash brown casseroles to tuna noodle casseroles. These recipes were passed down from generation to generation and made their way to us. Casseroles were the kind of dish that brought people together, not just because they were filling, but because they were often made with love and shared with family and friends. They were a reminder that even in the hardest of times, people found ways to come together and enjoy a meal. If you are considering giving up Starbucks as a hardship, just try making your coffee out of these plants. Dandelion coffee came into existence during the Dust Bowl when people could not afford coffee beans and other products. That's right, those yellow flowers that appear on your lawn in spring and are so annoying once provided the means to satisfy caffeine cravings at the survival level. For it, people would uproot dandelions, bake the roots until they were black and toasty, and then pulverize them into a brew. There was no sugar or cream, just the natural taste of roasted roots. It was not as strong as real coffee, but it provided people with something warm to drink in the mornings when they were unsure about the future. Moreover, dandelions were free and easily available. No need to go to Starbucks. To the chagrin of dandelion coffee, it is now considered a health drink. Rich in antioxidants, it is believed to have liver benefits and can be found at health food stores for a hefty price. It was not about the latest fad diet or the newest way to live a healthier lifestyle. It was about not going insane without your cup of coffee in the morning. I can't help but wonder how the farmers of Dust Bowl must have been feeling sipping on this dandelion brew and hoping for a better tomorrow and a decent cup of coffee. Now it is a retro chic beverage, while back then, dandelion coffee was a means of getting back to the normal, even if the normal tasted like the grass one mows. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. Now, if you think baking a cake without eggs, milk, or butter sounds impossible, think again. During the Dust Bowl, people got creative with their baking. This egg-free, milk-free, and butter-free cake was made with simple ingredients like flour, sugar, and vegetable oil. It was impossible to live without cake even in times of desperation, so people decided to make do without the fancy ingredients. Now, I know eggs, milk, and butter don't sound fancy to us, but these ingredients were a luxury to find during the Dust Bowl days, and even if you did find some, it was never enough to whip up a whole cake. The cake might not have been as rich as its traditional counterparts, but it was a sweet treat that offered a bit of comfort during difficult times. Oh, just a small something that came in from the backyard. Yes, the tumbleweed casserole was a real dish during the Dust Bowl, which just goes to show you that when the going gets tough, the tough make casseroles out of tumbleweeds. Tumbleweeds, those rolling shrubs of the Wild West screen, are actually technically, or at least partially, edible. Not fancy for the tongue, but we are hungry to the bone. Let's give it a try. Edible. The process began with the boiling of the tumbleweed leaves to reduce their coarse feel and also to reduce the bitterness of the leaves. Then they'd get layered with whatever ingredients were available, maybe some scraps of meat, potatoes, or canned goods if you were lucky. The result? A surprisingly substantial, earthy-flavored casserole that was as much about sustenance as it was about taste. Tumbleweed is very fibrous and even has a few vitamins in it, so it wasn't the worst thing to eat when fresh greens were scarce. Moreover, tumbleweeds were free and easy to come by, nature's grocery store if you will. Though you'll never see it on the dinner table. Tumbleweed casserole represents Dust Bowl endurance. Would I eat it? Well, I'd need a serious pep talk and a lot of seasoning. But hey, if the tumbleweed can take the hot winds, then it should not be a problem on my plate. Speaking of molasses, they also went really great with some slow-baked beans. Molasses have a knack for adding a lot of deep flavor to a dish, and the fact that these were usually left overnight to absorb all of it made for probably the best baked beans people could get in those times. It was especially popular as a summertime meal. Baked beans were not too hard to get, not the tinned versions because those were still pricey. Once you had some, you would just leave them in water to soften, and then the beans would be baked for 8 hours straight overnight. Making it was a whole day. Literally. But once you were done with the prep work, it was all just a waiting game. And this was one time where being patient really paid off. We've got one thing straight, meat was scarce during the dust storm era, so jackrabbits became a surprising alternative. These nimble critters were abundant in the wild, and they provided a valuable source of protein. Jackrabbits were often stewed or roasted, and its meat was said to be quite flavorful when prepared correctly. Jackrabbits, those long-eared critters that seemed to hop faster than a speeding bullet, became a potential meal. I'm not sure how they caught them, but I imagine it was a wild chase through a dust storm. Cooking jackrabbit was more of a skill than creativity, and preparing this dinner was a labor of hard work as it was a lean meat that needed to be tenderized and seasoned well, but when done right, it was totally worth it. If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that adage. In Texas as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on, especially in Indian American communities which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. What's not to love about a 3-ingredient delicious sauce? White sauce was the comforting meal you look forward to coming home to every night. It was a break from the bland foods of the dirty 30s, and the best part? It required just 3 common ingredients that were already staples in everyone's kitchen: flour, butter, and milk. This sauce is like an easy-breezy addition of the bechamel sauce, which is one of the mother sauces of French cuisine. This sauce is made from a white roux and milk, seasoned with ground nutmeg. Since we didn't have fancy ingredients on hand, the simple ones did the job. This sauce was used to top pasta, vegetables, casseroles, and even lasagnas. If you were lucky enough to have a bit of cheese in your pantry, it could be turned into a cheesy sauce. If you had some herbs, it could be seasoned to add extra flavor. And let's be honest, in tough times, a little creamy sauce can make everything taste just a bit better. When the Dust Bowl hit, farmers learned that they could take cottonseed, no joke, it's a byproduct of cotton cultivation, and make a loaf of something that could be eaten. Cottonseed loaf was the ultimate frugal meal, the idea of turning what was essentially waste into the main course. Cottonseed was poisonous and had to be cooked to remove the poison. Then it was ground and then added to flour, water, and whatever spices and leftovers people had. It's sort of like a meatloaf's distant relative, only there is no meat and, well, there's not a whole lot of taste. The loaf was heavy, tough, and by no means delicious, but it was quite healthy to sustain the people. The idea was not entirely radical. Cottonseed is very high in protein, and since it was already being fed to animals, it was only a short jump to try it out on humans. Spoiler alert, they could, but at the cost of a little pain. When the options are between cottonseed loaf and nothing, then the cottonseed loaf does not look too bad at all. Moreover, it is a good lesson on how people have to exist with what they have, even if what they have is cotton. Despite the prices of white sugar dropping as a whole after the First World War, leading molasses to decline in popularity, they made a strong comeback as the engine fueled a great batch of molasses cookies. People also started abandoning white sugar during the Second World War, and it caused them to look for alternatives for their yearly Christmas baking sessions, and the government was already pushing on molasses for widespread public use pretty hard. Eventually, people saw the value, and the ones that did not have to because it was so. Now, bacon grease might seem like a strange thing to highlight, but hear me out. In a time when oil was scarce, bacon grease was like liquid gold. It was used for everything from frying potatoes to greasing pans. And let's be honest, it adds a flavor boost to just about anything. Can you imagine making biscuits with bacon grease? Oh, it was good. Bacon was one of the few adorable meats during this time, and it left behind grease, which was way too good to just toss out. Now, I know this bad boy has no nutritional value, but sometimes all you need is a little flavor in your life, and it's fine to have cheat days sometimes, right? So, while it might not be the healthiest option, it certainly helped to make those Dust Bowl meals a little more enjoyable. Mildred Armstrong Kalish lived in Iowa during the Great Depression. She recalls cooking with bacon grease, which she called her family's Tuscan olive oil. So, you might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. Enjoyed this little insight into all the flavors of the 1930s? Then stay tuned for more content like this. And as always, leave a like if you enjoyed it.